Hi, I'm Divya.
Hi, I'm Karan.
Welcome to the 23rd episode of Thinking on Thinking. Today we talked about a lot of different things. We started from the premise of life always works out or things always come together. And we explored how we have arrived at that belief in our lives and how that might be related to psychology, how we see the world. And then we made some offshooted discussions to a bunch of other things, including some nuclear physics. We hope you enjoy.
Um, so there was this exhibit I saw at the Singapore Museum of Art and Science that was about how like things attract like. Did I tell you about this?
No.
Oh, it was super cool. So it was this artist had done this like interactive exhibit on the wall where people could walk up to it and you could touch the wall. And when you did, it caused a disruption and everything would float apart. So what was on the wall was these like particles that were all a color and they were just floating around. Okay. And the wall is like 2 stories high, and it's maybe I would say it's kind of like a hexagon sort of shape, like you're standing in the hexagon, and it's the half hexagon. You kind of feel like you're in a semi-enclosed space, right? And maybe like 6 people could easily interact with it at once. And all of these particles are different colors. And what starts to happen is the particles of the same color will start to gather together if you leave them alone. And then as soon as you touch them, they will fly apart and like chaos will like erupt. And then slowly over time, it will gather together. And what the artist is trying to illustrate with this is the notion that like attracts like, right? That like things will come together in the universe. That whole exhibit is a little bit talking about how it's like improbable, I guess, that like matter would have all found each other because the universe is so big, except that like matter attracts each other. Do you know kind of what that idea is?
Yeah.
Okay, you
Yeah,
might
I
have
mean,
to
like
explain it because
gravity.
okay. Is it just
Okay.
gravity?
I mean, like, yeah, of course.
Oh,
So,
I guess, yeah.
if you think about it, even though it takes millions of years for a hydrogen cloud to actually coalesce into a star, one on the like universe scale, that time is not too long. And ultimately, even though you have so few hydrogen atoms that maybe you begin with like, 1 atom or 2 atoms in a cubic meter, which is like insanely low,
Yeah.
right? But over time, because of the minute gravity that they all exert on each other, they keep coming together. um,
But that would
and
attract
so,
all
like,
kinds of matter, not just certain like
I mean, there is only hydrogen and helium in the universe. If you think about it broadly, that's just all that there is.
oh. And then where does everything else come from?
Oh, okay. So initially, when the universe began, there were only protons and electrons and, neutrons. So, like, the initial matter that formed was just hydrogen atoms and helium atoms. And then it's because of fusion reactions that took place that in the stellar core is. So, if you might have heard this quote, we are made of stardust.
Yeah.
It's because we are literally made of stardust. It's when a star, collapses and a supernova explosion happens, is when the heavier metals like carbon and iron and all of that gets, thrown out in the universe, which can serve as fuel for the next stellar disk that needs to be formed.
Oh. So and fusion reactions happen inside of stars.
Yeah.
Oh. So in the beginning the fusion reactions were only between hydrogen and helium, or hydrogen itself.
Hydrogen and hydrogen. Yeah, hydrogen and hydrogen would form other hydrogen and helium.
And then over time the entire periodic table was built, basically.
Yes,
Oh, that's so crazy. I
basically.
never realized that. Yeah, despite all the years of chemistry and physics I took, that was never explained to me in that way. Wow. So like there's constantly potentially more kinds of matter being formed in other stars we
Yeah.
haven't yet discovered.
Other kinds of matter, as in?
Like, I don't know, what's the highest number on the periodic table? Like,
I think we have made 200 something right now. But so okay, so there are two parts to this thing. One is once you how much of nuclear physics do you know?
Some I remember, like circles, like
Um, uh, uh, yeah. So
like
that
P.
is yeah, electron orbitals. But I don't mean that. I don't mean atomic physics. I mean nuclear physics. It's just the nucleus. Okay, so in nucleus you have two things, right? You have your protons and you have your neutrons.
Hmm.
There are two different forces that are at action there. Of course, gravity exists, but gravity at that smaller scale is negligible. You can just
I
ignore
remember
it,
this. Yeah.
right? So you have two forces: electromagnetic force, which is repulsion between two like particles, which is protons, right?
Yeah.
And strong nuclear force, which is what is binding different the neutrons and protons with each other.
Yeah.
Okay, so which is why, like, while hydrogen will have like most common form isotope of hydrogen as just a proton and an electron, the most common form of helium has two protons but also two neutrons to balance out the force.
Yeah.
So there is, like, two neutrons keeping the two protons together. But now if you think about, like, of course this is a very very oversimplified, definitely not quantum mechanically correct way analogy, but if you think about it, right, like, you keep assembling these balls together, right? Strong nuclear forces work only at very very close distances, like literally at nuclear distances. They are not effective at atomic distances also.
Okay.
So strong nuclear forces can keep only nucleus of a particular size together. So if you think about like elements beyond lead,
Yeah.
right, on the periodic table, almost all of them have nuclei so big that like protons on one side of it and on the other side of it will have stronger repulsion than the attraction force going to be able to keep them together with.
Oh, and that's why they're usually found in ion form.
That's why they are radioactive. Ions are chemical.
Oh.
This is nuclear physics, right? So you have to think about it in terms of radioactive isotopes. So almost everything out after lead, you don't have a stable isotope of them.
Oh. What about like aren't there noble gases after lead?
There would be one, which is radon.
Oh, and it's not stable?
Radon is a radioactive gas, noble gas. Okay, so there is chemistry which involves reactions between different elements, right? This is where your electrons and the SPDF orbitals that you mentioned, they come into picture, right? And that is where noble gases are non-reactive because their orbitals are fully filled. It's not exactly true for the higher order noble gases like xenon and all, because you have some empty orbitals. Like, they have not been seeded yet, but you have one empty orbital. Should I get into this?
Why do you have an empty orbital?
So think about, if you remember how your periodic table was filled, you have, like, 1s, then 2s, 2p,
Yeah.
3s, 3p, 4s, then 3d.
Yeah. I remember that.
So you are running, like, now suddenly one of your orbitals from the previous generation is running in the current generation.
Yeah.
Correct? So, like, you might have a 4 series running, but you haven't filled the 4f, right? So, like, the f orbital series is called lanthanides and actinides. If
Okay.
I like start with lanthanum, the first 4f, and then 5f is actinium, if I'm actinium or something like that. Really, it's been years. But because of that, like, you can actually make compounds out of xenon also. They're not particularly stable, but yeah, so that is one part of it. And then nuclear physics is about how stable is the nucleus of the atom itself. So generally, when we are doing chemistry and chemical reactions, we assume that the atom is never going to change. They're just going to combine in different forms. Now,
but that's not actually a safe assumption. Like, in real life, that's not what happens. Oh.
I mean, like in real life, that does happen. Most of the elements that we are surrounded by are not radioactive. They have what we call them stable isotopes.
Yeah.
So, hydrogen has three isotopes, right? Which is basically one proton, one electron is your hydrogen. Then one proton, one electron, and one neutron is deuterium. And then you have one proton and two neutrons. That one is not stable
Oh.
because inherently neutrons are also not stable. Neutrons have the tendency to decay into a proton and an electron. Um,
Oh.
so
I think I never learned
because
nuclear physics. I only ever learned it from chemistry point of view. This is entirely fascinating to me.
okay, so like because of how these like how the structure of the nucleus is, and I might be getting some stuff wrong also. Again, it's been almost a decade since I've like officially learned this stuff, but because of how the structure of the nucleus is, beyond lead we have not found any element that is stable. And like when you're thinking about most of the elements after lead, you have to almost all of them end up decaying into lead and something else, because lead is the last stable one, so they will keep losing neutrons and keep going one step back in the reaction until they arrive at a stable space. There is some hypotheses that some nuclear physicists have, which is like there might be islands of stability further on down the periodic table. So maybe at some point at 300 or something like that, we might have an island of stability where you find like 4 or 5 elements. But there is it's one of those things where like it's non-falsifiable. You can't tell that it's never gonna happen.
Yeah.
But it's
But
also very difficult to say.
Because we would
Yeah.
find elements of that if things beyond that were decaying to that.
Yeah.
Do things naturally occur at higher periodic table? Oh, we don't know because they decay so quickly.
Yeah, we don't know. Like, especially the later elements, most of them stay around for like 10 to the power minus 10 or minus 15 seconds or something like that.
Yeah.
So you're basically making them in these large hadron collider type places, and you just have them for like basically a blip in time. So like, to answer your question, we could have more elements, but the chances of that are pretty low.
Was that my original question?
You were saying that there might be a part of universe where like different elements that we have never found might be happening.
Got it. Yeah. Well, thank you. That was really interesting. I had not learned most of that, I feel. I think if I remember correctly, our physics teacher was part of the National Guard, and he got called up halfway through the year. And so we had substitutes for the rest of the year. And so we just didn't learn certain things. Which is, it's funny how that happens, right? Random events impact your life. Anyway, so yes, there was a cool exhibit I saw in Singapore, which kind of I felt like was kind of around this notion that we wanted to talk about, right? That like things attract like. I thought about commenting about how that was a really great explanation of nuclear physics that we used there, but I'm not sure we'll keep the whole thing. I don't know. So anyway, whatever. I mean, it was interesting. It was super interesting. There was this other notion that I kind of first thought of. Even for some reason, this notion just made me feel a little bit nervous, right? Where I was like, oh, why do I feel like hesitant about thinking about this? And I was like, well, it feels like a secret you shouldn't talk about with everyone. Do you feel that way?
About
this notion
that things would just end up happening?
Yeah, exactly.
A little bit. So last year, a friend of mine was thinking about starting consulting, and she asked me very earnestly, how will I get people? And I was like, just start talking to people and it will just happen. And she just looked at me very weirdly and she was like, that makes no sense, and I did not expect that answer from you. And I was like, yeah, I don't say that a lot, but somehow it almost always ends up happening that once you put yourself out there, things just start sort of working out for you, or like things just start. in a hokey way, one would say, oh, the universe conspires you to give you the thing that you want. And like, I can't say that with a straight face. But one of my friends had said this quite well. And I think that was the notion that you were also alluding to, that your brain like goes into the confirmation bias and selection bias
Yes.
process the moment you start biasing it. And if you can bias it towards the right things, which is also why, like, having a positive attitude towards things and like a growth mindset versus having a fixed mindset, why that changes your life so much, right? Because your brain is going to pick up on patterns regardless. So if you give it the right patterns to feed off of, that is a way better path than anything else. So yeah, but I agree. Like, it feels a little hokey to say. It's just
No,
like,
but
ugh, what kind of illogical things are you believing in? Ugh.
well, I think both of those things you said were quite interesting there. So I'll come back to the first one in a second. But I think for me, the reason why it feels like a secret, it's not so much that it feels hokey. It's like, or at least for me, I feel like there's a part of like the way that you can manipulate yourself and manipulate the brain that it's kind of uncomfortable to think about, right? We like to believe that we have all these notions of like free will and like, right, that we're always making independent decisions. And so it's kind of uncomfortable to acknowledge where it's like, oh yeah, if I do just acknowledge out loud the thing I want, it's more likely to happen. And it's like, why would that work? And part of that is because then you start to tell your brain that like, oh, this is the pattern of things that I want. And then when you start to see things similar to that pattern, or you start to understand what the signs are of things that lead to that pattern, you start to just gravitate towards those because you've acknowledged this is what I want. And in your example, right, once you start to talk to people more and more, you start to pattern match on saying, oh, these are the kinds of conversations I want. Then you start to understand, oh, these are the kind of people I want. And then you understand what to say to those people because you're always getting these feedbacks around this is good behavior, this is bad behavior, right? Or I think we've talked about in earlier episodes around like children and growing up. And I think in those contexts, it's really, right, you're always getting feedback on are you behaving in the right way.
Yeah. I also, like, as you were speaking, I was also thinking about this thing where it can also backfire if you don't combine it with action. Like, you said two things, right? Like, one is you set your intent correctly, and then the other is then you actively take actions towards it so that you can iterate and you give your brain a chance to pattern match. In between are your wants. On one side are I must, and on one side are I wish. And if you combine it with action, it starts moving towards I must. But if you don't, then slowly I want turns into I wish.
Right? So like if you want to do something and you don't do it, you're gonna feel like people like you don't do those kinds of things. Right?
Like, there, you are saying that there might be an identity mismatch there?
Well, you start to create an identity mismatch, is what I'm saying. And so then it becomes an aspirational identity.
Say, like, give more example or like, something more elaborate.
Okay, so I mean, at a really basic level, right? There could be like, oh, I wish I was in a different career path, right? And that comes from like, I want to do a different kind of work, right? But when you don't do that work, then it becomes like, oh, people like me don't do this work, right? I do the kind of work I do, right? And so it becomes, oh, I wish I was in a different career path. Maybe at a more complicated but tangible level, I would say even something, I mean, for me, often, like cooking examples come to mind, right? And I think like I have wanted to make some more complicated cakes in my time, but I've looked at them and I've just like shied away from them for various reasons at different points in time. But now it's kind of become this thing where it's like, do I really want to do it? I don't know. I wish I could do it, but like, right? Like I've convinced myself that I just don't need to do those kinds of things, right? Even as I'm telling this to you, I'm like, oh, well, because my husband likes to bake those, right? Like I don't really even need to. Right, I'm like, oh, and it's not really worth like how much cleaning up you have to do. Right? Like, there's so many like, I mean, and even I'm saying these, right? I make complicated things all the time that you might use like 5 different pans and 3 different pots, but for some reason, this has become a thing where I'm like, oh, yeah, I wanted to do it, but I didn't do it enough times. I feel like it's become a thing where I'm like, oh, that's not part of me. Now it's something I wish I was.
It's almost like there have been enough broken promises that you no longer consider that a reliable intent. Okay, so this is like not directly related, but recently I've mentioned this to you, but like a friend of mine has been working with somebody who is holding multiple roles and like is really successful in what he does and is like a genius level person.
Yeah.
Um, and there was this one time when I was talking to my friend, and he was just talking about how this guy just takes 2 minutes to do any admin task, and he like instantly replies to mail, and I'm sure he gets a lot of emails, but he just has zero overhead on his brain when he's thinking about doing admin things. And something about the way my friend was just describing this situation to me, I realized that I have always had this weird notion in my mind that admin tasks, of course, take long. I'm not the kind of person for whom they would happen quickly. And somehow that conversation just made me question, but why? Why would a 2 minute thing take you half an hour? Just like, where is that coming from? And something flipped. And now, yeah, really, admin tasks do just take me 2 minutes to do because I'm just not thinking about them in that manner. And like, as you were speaking about it, it's just like, it was a lifelong practice where I wouldn't do it. And then I would have convinced myself that, this is how long it is going to take me. For other people, it might not, but for me, it will take me this long.
That's funny. Yesterday, I went to have lunch with a friend, and after lunch, I was right by this museum that I've been wanting to go to called Fotografica, which is I think it's
Hmm.
originally from Sweden, and then they've opened this New York one. And then I don't know what
Hmm.
happened. I was just like, oh, do I even have time? Maybe I should go home. Like, I really need to do some work. And then I was also like, well, if I want to cycle home, then I really won't have time. And so I was like, oh, maybe what I should do is I should look up is like what exhibits are happening. So I'm literally standing outside the museum, right? I like look up like what exhibits they're showing and whatnot, and I conclude that there's this exhibit opening on the 2nd, and it's like $35 this entry. So I'm like, oh, I might as well go in 2 days. I don't know. And I was just thinking about that when you were talking. And I think sometimes part of what makes tasks feel longer is when you do a lot of research around tasks, right? Like, I think when you're saying about admin tasks, particularly, I had that notion, right? Because sometimes I'll just end up like, oh, like, looking up how to send some letter before I'm going to send it, right? Like who I
Hmm.
need to do it. And now you put so much unnecessary, you aren't planning to deal with it right now. You're just looking up stuff
Yeah.
around it. So then you have
Yeah.
invested more time into the thing. So I don't know.
Yeah.
It's an interesting notion to me because I think sometimes it's part of like building up the enthusiasm, right? Like I
Hmm.
realized sometimes like I'm often like a minute or two late to talk to you, and part of it is like I feel like I need that like that almost that feeling of like, oh my god, I'm running late, where I'm like, oh, like now I've like have enough motivation to like drop whatever I was doing. It's very interesting.
Oh no. Maybe I should message you 5 minutes early, be like, I'm already here. Yeah. It's very interesting how, like, sometimes when we are thinking about these things, it's almost like you're walking on a very thin edge. If you don't do things like perfectly in one direction, you will slip. And if you don't do things perfectly in the other direction, also, you will slip.
Interesting. And then when you say these things, you mean like your brain.
Or behavior. You can say behavior.
Okay.
Um, like, yeah, my brain, I guess.
I don't know. I mean, I also think like one has more resilience sometimes than we think, right? Or maybe I would say more resistance to building new patterns. Like, I tried all sorts of addictive substances, and luckily I've like never become addicted to any of them, right? Like my father is a smoker. Most of my family were smokers at different points in time, and like I smoked a lot when I was in India because it was just like culturally what people did. We would like go out for smoke breaks. And I'm a
Yeah.
terrible sucker for doing what everyone else is doing. But I've never had that feeling where I've woken up and wanted a cigarette in the morning. So I don't know, right? Like I feel like sometimes you do have to worry about like building bad behavior patterns really quickly and whatnot, and sometimes like you have more kind of resilience. I think maybe it also comes from what you think about, right? And maybe come back to the notion I was saying a few seconds ago. if you feel like part of your identity is a certain kind of thing, it's going to be
Hmm.
really hard for you
Yeah.
to build a bad behavior pattern if you feel like that's not part of your identity.
Hmm. Yeah, that, but actually, like, I think, I mean, works in the reverse also. It can also really stop you from engaging in good behaviors, which is what you were saying sometimes. Like, it just slips away from us and goes into, I wish I could do this, but can people like me really do this? Have there been things where you felt like when you were, which seemed pretty hard, but then once you set your mind to it, things came together and, like, life found a way, in your words?
I mean, I kind of had decided that summer when I was living in Rochester and was like cooking a lot and writing, the summer of 2015, that one of the things I wanted to do was spend more time with my family in India while they were like still, in good health and whatnot. And I ended up moving to India that year in a way I could have never really expected, but it
Hmm.
happened, right? Um, and I felt like my relationship at that point was untenable, and that also resolved itself in a way that I at that point couldn't have imagined, right? So like at that point in my life, I felt like you do always get what you want, but it's often in a way you couldn't have predicted.
Interesting. I was recently listening to somebody's interview and they said something similar. They said life will always work out. It might not work out in the ways that you want it to work out, but it will always work out because tomorrow will always come.
Yeah, right. So I think that's kind of an interesting way to think about it, and it's just maybe broadening your view of what is acceptable. I don't know.
I think it might also be another thing. So, like, both you and I have a fairly optimistic disposition.
Mm.
And so it might be that, like, we are more likely to think that life will work out.
That's what I was kind of thinking about, but not being able to articulate a second ago. Yeah, that it kind of depends on what you're willing to accept, and if you broaden your purview of saying this is my acceptable or this is even my delightful range, then it's a lot easier to be
Yeah.
delighted.
I mean, there have been studies on that also, right? Like, that people who perceive themselves as lucky are more lucky.
Yeah.
And it's just very interesting. I think their study is with them sort of asking people to count the number of vowels or number of ants in the headlines of a newspaper or something like that. And one of the articles on the newspaper contains this snippet of this newspaper has this many ants in headlines, and people who like rated themselves as very lucky in life were the ones who were way more likely to find that line than the ones who didn't.
Well, that kind of goes to, even what, I don't know if you know this, but like when girls start school, I know in the US, I'm not sure if this is true everywhere, but they tend to be
Hmm.
at par with boys in mathematics schools. But as they go up through school, girls start to drop behind. And
Yeah.
right, so the kind of contention, the theory in contention that I've heard at least is like that people start to hear and ingest these myths that like, oh, girls are not good at
Hmm.
school, right? So I think similarly, if you
Yeah.
start to believe like you're someone who's lucky, right, you're going to put in that kind of effort to feel like you are lucky, right? And sometimes being lucky does mean paying attention to unexpected things and searching a little bit harder or whatever. Like that is how you
Yeah.
make your
Or
luck.
even like subconscious stuff, right? Like your brain might not even know what you are thinking about and what you are talking about or doing. One of the things that came to my mind when you were talking about how like girls have similar ability of mathematics when they are younger in the US, but like it drops off later on. There was a study done on women where they were given scars, like they were given prosthetic scars, and they were told that what they're trying to study is the effect of like facial deformation on how people perceive you during interview,
Mm,
etc., etc.
yeah.
And then they said before the women, like they showed the women the scar, and then before they were about to go, they said, "Ki, oh, we'll just do a touch up," but then in the touch up they would remove the scar. So like the women have gone normally, but the interesting thing was that those women really did report a lot of quote unquote discrimination based on their facial features and appearance, and they attributed a lot of it to the scarring of how people, they even found out things that the interviewers said that were pointedly about their appearance while there was nothing wrong with their appearance.
Because the scar had been removed.
Yeah.
They just thought they had the scar.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
And this was like one of those like just looking at, do people actually get impacted by their own perceptions of how others might see them?
Yeah, I think we actually talked about that in one of our first few episodes, right? But I mean, yeah, it's definitely true, right? Like how your perception of what you think other people think of you just can shape your experience of things.
One other thing that I have recently been thinking about, and as we were just talking about this idea of like setting intent and then like letting your brain find the patterns, was this is a very common notion that you should focus on one thing and just work on that one thing. But both of us are not the kind of people who will just focus on one thing. And while I've always experienced the benefits of not focusing on one thing, I've rarely been able to articulate them. And I think this is one of those things that is the benefit of working on multiple things. You give your like brain 3 or 4 different things that it can pattern seek about. And then whatever matches.
That's interesting.
Right? It's almost like letting things slow cook. And you have like 4 burners and you just leave all of them on, and like slowly it all gets like richer in flavor.
And it's like that notion you were telling me about a few days ago with those 12 questions.
Yeah.
Who was it? Who that was?
Feynman?
Yeah.
Yeah, Richard Feynman. Like he had 12 problems that he was constantly thinking about, and whenever he would come across a new insight, he would try and match it to all of them and see if something new comes up anyway. And like I'm not even saying something that active, although I am trying to incorporate that more in my life now because like that just feels amazing. But even beyond that, right? Like I'm sure that sometimes when you have been thinking about, I don't know, stuff that you're working on on your investor side, and then you might be thinking about stuff that is happening on like, you know, your idea for a restaurant side, and then something around joyous, and then something in your personal relationship, and there is always like some cross pollination that can happen.
I think so. I mean, I don't really so much think about things in that way. I more find like that I'll give myself sometimes almost like random data points, right? And then I'll find that I'll kind of like revisit things and have made progress on them, if that makes sense. Like, for example, I'm like, there's a scene I'm like trying to rewrite for this play that I've been working on. And like, I know I have like the broad strokes of what it's going to look like, and like whenever I keep going out to places and like doing things, like sometimes like I'll think about different parts of it, but I'm not like actively sort of thinking about it. Like I'm just kind of like right, and I know at some point I'll like sit down and I'll have done some more work on it. But I tend to not so much like I don't sit down and be like, oh, I'm thinking about this thing. Sometimes.
Have you never done that?
I mean, sometimes, but usually when I'm like in an active form, like I'll be like, oh, I'll like write about it or I'll brainstorm about it, and then like.
I think I want to add more of that kind in my, like that is what I'm almost like taking away from this conversation. So my sister has been doing this thing where like every week she's taking out 30 minutes to just talk to herself about things that she's doing and she's wanting to do. It's just like 30 minutes or an hour, like it's just a strategy time.
Yeah.
It's not anything else.
Yeah. I mean, I find that because I like to be in an activity when I'm doing something, like I'll do something else, right? So like I will like, there's like some places I like to go for a walk, or I've been like going for more like meditation because I'm a big one for group activities, right? And so like, you know, those give you like space for at least like finding the thoughts, right? If not, maybe like actively engaging with them, but sometimes actively engaging with them too. Depends on.
When you are finding these passive thoughts, where do they come from? Now that we're like, you know, already in the hokey territory.
I guess usually I remember something. Like seeing
As in?
something, thinking about something, or like something caught my attention. Usually, like I remember that something caught my attention in a certain way.
Do you talk to yourself?
No,
No.
sometimes. I mean, sometimes, but not in those moments. It's not that I'm like, oh, remember when we saw this thing?
Wait, when you're brainstorming with yourself, you do not talk to yourself.
But I'm not brainstorming then.
Or like, wait, without talking to yourself, ideas come to you, generally.
Yeah, like for example, I remember I was walking. Yeah, I don't know. I think I like sat down on this bench, and this guy like was taking a picture above me, and then I don't know. He just like reminded me of someone. Sometimes it's hard, right? Because I think that I was thinking about them, and then I was thinking about like a mutual friend of ours who also writes poetry, and then I was thinking about poetry, and then I was thinking about how I could apply for that the summer writing program.
This is so interesting. Not that you
Like,
can make random connections, because, like, of course, everybody makes random connections, but I think what you said earlier, where you're like, no, not always, is the interesting part, because I think that when I'm doing creative work, sure, I don't think I have an active dialogue with that part of myself. But almost every other thing, like especially for cognitive problem solving, I'm almost always talking to myself in some way, shape, or form.
oh, like what if we try this? No, what if we try this? Like what if we do it this way?
Yeah. Or like this wouldn't work and this would not work because of this, and then one can try that, and there is that study. Like basically, how I talk is also how I internally talk.
Huh. Interesting. I don't know. Maybe I'll have to try that sometime.
Maybe like there is an inner voice in your head, and it's just such a big part of your life that you don't even recognize that it is. It could be that.
Yeah.
Probably not, though. Okay, this is like a really fun episode.
Yeah, I think it was interesting. I feel like we really kind of started from one place and covered a bunch around it, but it was an interesting conversation.
Yeah, especially with an aside to nuclear physics. Who knew?
Okay, this was fun. Bye.
Bye. This is super fun.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Thinking on Thinking. Our theme music is by Steve Coombs.
If you were interested in today's topic or any of the topics we've discussed, please get in touch with us. You can reach us on our website, joyous.studio.